3 American soldiers, all highly trained, all sworn to protect and serve. But instead, they committed crimes so brutal, so unforgivable, that even the battlefield had never seen anything like it. These weren't enemies of the state. These were men wearing the U.S. uniform. They didn't just betray the flag, they betrayed their own brothers and sisters in arms. And now, each one sits in a lonely cell on military death row, waiting for the day the government ends their lives. You might think you've heard the worst of military scandals. But trust me, what you're about to see goes beyond that. Ronald Adrian Gray was born on August 14, 1965 in Cochran, Georgia, but grew up in Liberty City, a public housing project in Miami. He enlisted in the U.S. Army at 18, seeking stability and purpose. Assigned to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, Gray served as a cook in the 82nd Airborne Division. To his peers, he was quiet and disciplined. But beneath the surface, he harbored dark desires. Between 1986 and 1987, a series of brutal crimes shocked the Fort Bragg community. Women began to vanish. Some were later discovered in shallow graves, naked, violated, executed. Others were found brutally beaten and left for dead. The brutality was beyond comprehension. Gray's crimes included the rape and murder of Private Laura Lee Vickery Clay, age 18, who disappeared from Fort Bragg. Her decomposed body was found weeks later, having been raped, sodomized, and shot multiple times. Another victim, Kimberly Ann Ruggles, a local cab driver, was dispatched to Gray's address. She was later found raped and murdered. A turning point came when Private Mary Ann Lang Namath survived an attack by Gray. She provided a chilling description of her assailant, leading investigators to Gray. A search of his residence uncovered blood-stained clothes, weapons, and souvenirs taken from his victims like trophies. Gray was connected to at least 4 murders and multiple rapes. One victim was pregnant. Another was dragged from her home in the middle of the night. At his court-martial, Gray sat stone-faced while prosecutors laid out the evidence. DNA linked him to the crimes. Victim testimony painted him as a predator, and the military didn't hesitate. He was sentenced to death. In 2008, President George W. Bush approved the execution order. But due to appeals and legal wrangling, Gray is still alive today, over 30 years later, awaiting execution at Fort Leavenworth. But just when you think the horror couldn't get any worse, it did. Because while Ronald Gray stalked civilians outside the base, another soldier would soon unleash violence from within the very heart of his own unit. A man whose betrayal came not at night, but under the same tent, surrounded by his brothers in arms. Hassan Akbar, born Mark Fidel Cools on April 21, 1971 in Watts, Los Angeles, California, grew up in a turbulent environment. His father converted to Islam while in prison, changing the family surname to Akbar. Akbar pursued higher education, earning degrees in aeronautical and mechanical engineering. He joined the Army in 1998, serving in the 101st Airborne Division. March 2003. U.S. troops were staged in Kuwait, just days from launching the invasion of Iraq. Tension was high. Soldiers were prepping gear, writing letters, praying. But no one saw the betrayal coming. Under the cover of darkness, Akbar made his move. He slipped into the weapons locker, grabbed grenades and a rifle, and walked quietly toward the tents where his fellow soldiers were sleeping. He pulled the pin on a grenade and tossed it into a command tent, then another. As chaos erupted, he opened fire, gunning down officers who never even had time to reach for their weapons. 2 were killed, 14 wounded, some left permanently disabled. These weren't strangers or foreign enemies. These were men he trained with, ate with, lived with. Akbar later claimed he couldn't bring himself to fight other Muslims, but investigators found notebooks filled with hate, paranoia, and resentment. He felt disrespected, angry, alone, But instead of seeking help, he became a murderer. In court, it was revealed that Akbar planned the attack days in advance. He timed it for maximum impact, and he targeted leadership, hoping to cripple the chain of command. He showed no remorse at trial, and in 2005, the military sentenced him to death. Even today, Akbar remains on death row, alone, forgotten by many, but not by those who served beside him, who carried the scars of that night forever. You'd think nothing could top that level of betrayal, striking your own during wartime. But then years later, another soldier would commit an even more devastating attack. This time, not in the desert, but in broad daylight on American soil and against soldiers who were completely unarmed, and the man behind it wasn't a grunt or a misfit. He was the one they trusted to heal the broken. Nidal Hasan was born on September 8, 1970 in Arlington County, Virginia, to Palestinian immigrant parents. He pursued a career in medicine, earning a medical degree and becoming a psychiatrist in the U.S. Army. Assigned to Fort Hood, Texas, Hasan was responsible for treating soldiers suffering from PTSD. November 5, 2009, Fort Hood, Texas. Soldiers lined up inside a medical center preparing for deployment. It was routine, boring even, until a man in uniform stood up, shouted, "Allahu Akbar," and opened fire. Hasan fired over 200 rounds in just 10 minutes, killing 13 people and injuring more than 30 others. It was the deadliest mass shooting ever to take place on a U.S. military base. But the most terrifying part, the warning signs were there. Hasan had been emailing radical cleric Anwar al-Awlaki. He had openly expressed support for jihad. He had told colleagues that Muslims should rise up against America. And still, no one stopped him. After the shooting, Hasan was paralyzed by police return fire. He survived, was arrested, and represented himself at trial. He showed no regret, no shame. In fact, he told the court he switched sides, and that he now saw himself as a soldier for the Taliban. The military sentenced him to death in 2013. In 2023, that sentence was unanimously upheld. Today, Nidal Hasan sits paralyzed in a wheelchair on death row, a man who traded his oath for ideology and who turned a military base into a killing ground. 3 soldiers, 3 paths to death row, and all of them wore the uniform they would one day betray. Death row in the military isn't like it is in the civilian world. It's smaller, colder, and far less forgiving. Only a handful of service members have been sentenced to die since the 1980s. Executions are rare. The last one happened more than 60 years ago. And yet, it's coming. Each military death sentence must pass through layers of review: military appeals courts, federal courts, and even the desk of the president. That's why these men sit for years, sometimes decades, in solitary confinement. Inside Fort Leavenworth, Ronald Gray, Hasan Akbar, and Nidal Hasan each live in isolation. No contact, no noise, just the ticking of time. Waiting. And while their appeals continue, the victims' families continue to wait too. For closure, for justice, for the moment when silence finally falls. They trained hard, took an oath, wore the stars and stripes on their shoulders. But in the end, these 3 men betrayed everything the U.S. military stands for. Ronald Gray, who preyed on innocent women at home. Hasan Akbar, who attacked his brothers in arms in the darkness. Nidal Hasan, who turned his gun on his own in cold blood. They didn't die in battle. They didn't die heroes. They'll die behind bars, stripped of their rank, their honor, and their legacy. For the families left behind, justice has moved slowly. But it's coming. And when it does, the world will be reminded that no uniform, no rank, no title makes you untouchable. Because in the end, justice wears no uniform, and execution is the final salute.